Under the banner of No Kings protests. The widespread protests have raised voices against the Trump administration. The movement asserts that the executive is using its power without considering the limits imposed by the Constitution. The first major No Kings protest occurred in June, drawing millions of participants across the United States. Over 5 million people participated during those protests. The protests were to challenge the army parade on President Trump's birthday celebrations. However, the second wave of protests has gained momentum, garnering support from Democratic leaders and civil society personalities. These events have taken place in the backdrop of government shutdown. More than 7 million people joined the demonstrations in more than 2,500 locations across 50 states. The people are protesting against the government shutdown and what they perceive as the administration's authoritarian policies. Let's in fact listen into what the protesters had to say.
Here because I'm a U.S. citizen, was born in the U.S., have been deeply troubled by the turns that have taken place since Trump got reelected, and don't accept what's happening. I think it's hugely problematic for the state of U.S. democracy, but it gives an example to so much more of the world, and the networks that are propelling Trump are at work everywhere.
I think even though this may seem like an American-centric issue, it really isn't. We can see the rise of fascism around the world.
I think that the state of the world that we are in right now is really horrible. I want my rights back. I'm pissed off. I need Trump out of office. And yeah, no king.
Ross Feingold, political analyst, is joining us from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, appreciate you being over here. Well, what do these protests signify? The one thing which is noticeable and extremely palpable at this point in time, that more people have joined in at this time than there were people the last time such a protest took place. What does this mean, for the democratic fabric in the United States, which says, or rather the Democratic Party and its supporters say, that the Constitution is being compromised?
Ultimately, it might not mean much. And the reason why I say that is this just might be people who didn't vote for Trump or Republicans anyway in the last election or the last several elections. So what it means for future elections, it's just completely unknown at the moment. Does it signal a significant shift away from Trump and Republicans? I think that remains to be seen. It's certainly possible. I mean, people are frustrated about the continued increase in the cost of living, for example. But the people who voted for Trump, which is approximately half the electorate, for the most part, they're still happy with him. And that's on a range of issues. People who voted for Trump, they voted for him whether because of social issues or because Trump promised to crack down on illegal immigration. And people who voted for Trump, frankly, they have many reasons to be happy with him. And again, these protests look enthusiastic, but is it the early signs of a significant movement? I think it's simply too early to tell.
Right. And Ross, let's also talk about the fact that Donald Trump perhaps becomes one of those very few presidents who's, in fact, had to face or, come to, in fact, some sort of, a meeting point with a large part of the population of the United States that does not agree with his policies.
Well, I think any president deals with that, right? The last few elections, notwithstanding the result in the Electoral College, have shown the electorate is fairly divided, and the U.S. Congress, whether the House or the Senate, those have swung back and forth in the recent decade plus, as well, swung back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. So we have a very highly partisan environment in the United States. That's obvious. Is it going to change anytime soon? Of course not. Elections will continue to be close, including next year's congressional elections, where the map looks good for the Republicans in the Senate, but it will be a bit more difficult to defend the House. But they might very well do so. And then we'll look back on these No Kings protests and say, well, it was just a bunch of enthusiastic people, but it didn't really signify a trend. On the other hand, sure, there's plenty of time and plenty of issues over which popular opinion against President Trump and Republicans could grow, but again, it's just too early to say.
Ross, appreciate you joining us. Thank you. All right, President Donald Trump has announced that the United States will be sending 2 suspected drug traffickers back to their native Ecuador and Colombia after a military strike on their drug smuggling submarine in the Caribbean killed 2 others. Colombian President Gustavo Petro confirmed the Colombian suspect had been repatriated but accused Washington of having killed a fisherman in an earlier strike. The strike is the latest in an unprecedented U.S. military campaign that President Trump says is aimed at choking the flow of drugs from Latin America to the United States. At least 6 vessels, most of them speedboats, have been targeted by U.S. strikes in the Caribbean since September, with Venezuela alleged to have been the origin of some of them. All right, David K. Johnston, American author, is joining us from New York at this point in time. David, appreciate you joining us. While it's a good thing that Donald Trump is extremely passionate about controlling the inflow and influx of drugs into American borders, but there are a number of detractors who go about saying that the approach and perhaps the methodology with which there's been a fallout with other countries is perhaps not the best way to deal with it. Your thoughts?
Well, it's certainly not the best way to deal with it because it's 100% illegal. No law, no power in the American Constitution gives the president the authority to do what Trump is doing. And in at least 2 of these cases, we have good reason to believe that these were not drug boats. They were poor fishermen who were murdered, and I mean that word very intentionally, by American military forces. A number of retired military lawyers have all said loudly and clearly in multiple forums that there is no legal authority for what Trump is doing. If you suspect a boat has a contraband on it, whether it's drugs, guns, money, whatever, you interdict the boat, you inspect. If you find contraband, you seize it and you arrest the occupants. If you don't, you let the people go. But summarily killing people is something Donald Trump has been calling for since 1989, when he bought 5 full-page ads in major newspapers demanding the immediate execution of 5 young men accused of beating and raping a woman in Central Park. Of course, we now know those young men were innocent. We have the DNA and other proof and a confession from the actual perpetrator, and yet when these young men were released, Donald Trump reiterated his position that they should be summarily executed. This is murder, plain and simple.
David, what do you make of the protests that are happening in the United States at this point in time? In fact, these protests are not limited to the U.S. alone. There have been similar protests in certain European cities as well. Do you think the overall impression that Donald Trump has been giving when it comes to overreaching or perhaps even overarching above the Constitution is sending a very wrong signal?
Well, your previous guest, Mr. Feingold, made what I thought was a very good point. These protests are not large enough to move the needle. Research by scholars who study authoritarianism says you need a minimum of 3.5% of the public out demonstrating to get real results. 7 million people isn't close. You need a minimum of 12 million people for those Republicans who understand that Donald Trump is behaving as a dictator. He's asserting authorities he does not have under our Constitution. And we got about 7 million, seems to be the most widely reported number. So that's essentially a little more than half of what's needed. And to really move the needle, I think you need to have 15, 20 million people turn out. Now, that may happen, especially when warm weather returns to much of the U.S. In April of next year before the elections, as the economy falters, as Trump and his cronies profit off the presidency, as healthcare premiums soar and many people lose healthcare coverage, and we see malnutrition among poor pregnant women and infants. But unless those numbers grow more, and for this demonstration they grew 40%, so that is a substantial increase in the turnout, that's not going to move what matters, and that is some of the Republicans to break with Trump the way Marjorie Taylor Greene has.